Hello and welcome to another episode of the N64 Magazine Time Capsule. This is the show where we take a chronological look at N64 Magazine issues, and today we're up to issue number 17, which is from July 1998. This was such a great summer for me personally, and this issue brings back so much nostalgia. Banjo and Link grace the cover, but the most eye-catching thing was that Capcom were finally unveiling their N64 titles, and the tease that Street Fighter would land on the console was hyped. James Ashton, the magazine's editor this month, focuses on the fact that the follow-up to GoldenEye from Rare now had a name, Perfect Dark, and that the Twine movie license had been snapped up by EA. He also tells us that Tim's been over at E3 and armed with a laptop and a modem, he's been emailing them regular updates with all the latest news to pack into the issue. James also acknowledges that the game drought on the N64 is over from next month, as a whole host of games are scheduled, and although they had a copy of Banjo Kazooie land in their office, they're just holding off on their full review until next month to give the game plenty of time to allow them to experience it, rather than hash together a quick review for the sake of being the first to the market. The contents page has some nice artwork, but what always caught my eye were the images in the top right for Force Gemini, Turok 2 and Space Circus, which I think always looked stunning. Future Look gives us this month's first look at some huge N64 titles. First up is Force Gemini, and knowing the game was coming from Rare, it was so exciting to see just how cool this game looked. I loved the space theme and the art direction in the game, and the way that they took here, well, the magazine just drooled all over its visuals and noted that the lighting effects in particular were beautiful. They state that they believe the game would do for shoot-em-ups what Mario 64 had done for the platform game genre, and so that's some high hopes for sure. Turok 2 is up next, and the magazine discusses just how far the FPS genre has evolved in the year since the original game's release, most notably with the release of GoldenEye. The magazine confirms that even Iguana said upping GoldenEye is their challenge, and especially in multiplayer, they've added many different modes to really make it a great experience solo or with friends. Now, disappointingly here though, the magazine discusses Iguana's plans for the campaign to be co-op, and working together with friends to defeat the Primogen. This is something I would have loved personally, but the game is still fairly early at this stage, so it's interesting to see how much changed even from these early screenshots. Space Circus, which would obviously later go on to become Starshot, gets covered next, and the team were quickly to raise concerns they had with the game's camera system and suggesting that it would need something more fluid like they'd seen in Banjo Kazooie. They also praised the game's interesting environments and noted that the game had been in development for over 3 years now, and so they expected a more playable version but hoped that it would be available for them to access by the end of summer. Planet 64 kicks in next, and this is a crazy one. They gave a brief overview of E3, whilst holding back much detail for later in the magazine, but they did confirm that they'd played Zelda and it was incredible. They also said that they'd seen Perfect Dark on video and couldn't believe it was running on real N64 hardware because it looked that good. They also noted Shadowman had a cool section based on the London Underground, and there was a whole host of great looking racing games on the horizon for the N64. The funniest part for me though was that they noted that there was a new Star Wars game coming called Rogue Squadron, which had been received well by the E3 Expo, but that they didn't personally really like it. However, they did note it was only about 30% complete at that time. News that Nintendo was involved in a British comedy movie called Virtual Sexuality was also covered. Now, I watched a ton of movies around this time, and personally I'd never heard or seen this movie, but it is described as a cross between Weird Science and Clueless. The magazine praises Nintendo for trying to get involved in something a little more trendier than normal, but from how little I've ever heard about this promotion, I'd guess that the movie was either panned on its release or likely went straight to VHS. Planet 64's coming soon games are up next, and there's quite a lot to pack in this issue. The little notepads they have all over the place are notes that they received from Tim Weaver that he'd sent over to the magazine from E3 with his comments, and WipEout 64 is placed as a direct competitor for Nintendo's own F-Zero. Tim says that the game runs beautifully, and the version that he played though didn't have, well, all of the lighting or weapon effects in it yet. Likewise though, Extreme G2, he said it is not as difficult as the first game and the overall speed felt much slower. Thankfully though, he says that World Grand Prix looks and runs even better than the PlayStation 1's F1 game, and the included scenario mode was a fantastic idea. Earthworm Jim 3D is up next, and this is fascinating. Now for those not in the know, the game went through absolute development hell, and at this time the magazine played the game, it was more like a traditional 2D platformer with 3D visuals. Whilst the overall concept of the game didn't change much, it did become a proper 3D game for better or for worse. At this time there were about 30 odd levels, and you can see from the screenshots much of what they show here was later scrapped and never made it into the final build of the game. Shadowman, which was at this stage just a few months away from release, gets covered, and it's fair to say the hype and praise for this game was huge. It was described as a cross between Resident Evil and Tomb Raider, and it was described as being phenomenally good looking and praised for the lack of fog and the darker overall tones of the game. I remember reading this and salivating, thinking how cool it sounded with serial killers, loads of gore, and the small details being highlighted as really adding to the atmosphere. It's interesting that despite the game being a few months away from release, some of the screenshots shown are definitely beta elements, as there's shots here you don't come across in the final build of the game. But Bumble has come on leaps and bounds since the magazine last played it a few months ago, and they highlighted that they'd quite like to see some more variation in the levels, and adding some colour wouldn't go amiss. But they did describe the game as having cool weapons and a bit more like a free roaming Star Fox. Now funnily enough, they also spoke to the game's composer, who said that they're going for a speed garage soundtrack to make the game feel more adult, and so who can ever forget the classic theme song for Bumble. The Banjo Kazooie preview is right here, and the team here describe how they received a phone call from the Rare Studios inviting them to come up to the studio to play the game, and after a few hours of driving they were plonked in front of a Sony CRT, a development cartridge of the master was fired up, and their minds were blown for the rest of the visit. It was around this time that my brother became incredibly ill and was in hospital for months over this summer. Now I remember reading these pages over and over again whilst at the hospital with him most evenings, and we would discuss which games we should get when they were released. I'd often take the N64 console to the hospital because they only had an old NES and a handful of games, and so I'm sure discussing and playing N64 was a nice break from the pain that he was in at the time. The biggest story of 1998 was up next, and that was the reveal of Perfect Dark. Described as a GoldenEye with everything even further enhanced and improved, it's fair to say that everyone had been waiting for this reveal to see what Rare would bring us next. The game was shown on video at E3, and a select few people got to play it in private. But from these screenshots my mind was blown that it was running on a console, as it looked even better than some of the FPS games I was playing on PC at that time. Tim Weaver said that the game was great looking, and it nearly made him cry. And although I wouldn't go that far myself, I will say that it was clear Perfect Dark was going to be another revolution, rather than just an evolution that some of us had perhaps been expecting. It made it clear that Rare were not resting on their laurels and had many more aces up their sleeve. Now as promised, here's a much more in-depth look at what was shown off at E3. Now I'd like to focus on some of the more unusual elements here, because Duck Dodgers was previously known as Duck Dodgers in the Third and a Half Dementia at that time. Well, for obvious reasons, this was likely changed fairly quickly. Harrier Strike Force was a game from Paradigm and Video System, which from the looks of it was also changed to be called Aero Fighters Assault. There's also a hands-on play with the platform game called Jest, which was eventually cancelled, and even Tim noted that the character had the most annoying walk in video game history. He also notes that Knife Edge really needed a light gun peripheral to really make the game playable and enjoyable. Survivor Day 1 from Konami was also a hands-on play, and it was a game which I loved the sound of, and I would flick through the magazine trying to find news of it whenever a new copy of the magazine would come out. It was cancelled when they realised they'd never finish it before the console ended, but there's so many great screenshots and even a 3-minute video of the game which you can go check out online. 12 Tales is also shown off and described as good looking, but that's about it. Superman was also panned as being butt ugly, and hopes were laid that they did more work to make it actually good before they finally released it. N64 Arena is up next with this month's reviews, and there's a couple of import titles that the magazine gets their teeth stuck into. Like the editor said in his letter at the start of the magazine, after this month the game drought on the console should be over, and so this month's reviews are slim pickings. GT64 is up first, and let's be honest, the review isn't pretty. The main issue the magazine had was that the game proclaimed it had 12 tracks, when in actual fact it was just 3, and also had a mirror mode and alternative routes on each. They also felt like the handling was a step back from MRC, although they did say that once you get the hang of it, they did quite like it. They also said that there was plenty of work to do with a sequel already being planned by the studio, but overall they felt it was not the racer it was trying to be, and the fact that they called it GT64 was a clear attempt to cash in on any Gran Turismo rub that they have been able to get. A score of 67% seems somewhat generous here. Buster Move 2 gets a mixed review, and the magazine praises the fact that at its core Buster Move is an incredibly fun and enjoyable puzzle game that's welcome on the console. The downside, and perhaps their biggest criticism, is that it seems like a direct port of the PlayStation version, and a very poor port at that. Going on to call it the world's worst conversion is harsh, but it's loosely said in jest. But the points they raise about the poor sound quality, washed out colours and horrific borders on this PAL release is summarised with the studio clearly doing next to no work to optimise it for the console release before pushing the game out to cash in. 80% is a fair score, however it's not a must-buy title, but it's one which anyone would get some enjoyment from. The import review of Dual Heroes got 24% in a previous issue, and so now with the PAL release the game ended up with a 50% score, which is still very poor. The magazine noted some fairly nice animations at the time and some cool features like the virtual arcade, but overall the incredibly bad AI, which is easy to trick out your opponent, made this a game which they suggested your friends would laugh at you if they knew you'd paid £55 for. I'd agree, and even looking at these screenshots of the game, it never appeared to be a game which I was ever in a hurry to rush out and buy, and the fact that it was in the bargain bin the week after its release in my local game store told me pretty much everything that I needed to know about it when combined with this review. Oh, and they also highlighted again the horrific black borders of the PAL release, which was always a big bugbear of mine. Aero Gauge rolls along, and it ended up being one of the worst reviewed scores that the magazine ever published. Now this will be a divisive score, because I know from my own review of the game years ago that many people commented saying how much they actually enjoyed the game as a kid. Well, I never did, and this was a game which I would avoid at all costs. When you have games like F-Zero or WipEout on the console, I can't see any reason anyone would go out of their way to play this. The audio is described as the reason your TV has a mute button, and a verdict that states if you spend £50 on it, there will be tears should tell you everything you need to know about the game. On to Import Arena now, and finally a good game. Bomberman Hero gets an import review, but oh dear. Tim Weaver was handed this title, and I really don't think that he gets to grips with the game. Much of the review is suggesting any sequel to Bomberman 64 should have been more of an update with more multiplayer modes and features, but instead this was more of a level-based game. Bizarrely, he suggests it's more of a 2D game than a 3D one, but his biggest criticism of the game is that it's broken down in such small chunks that each sub-level feels like a flash in the pan before it's all over too quickly. And 7 out of 10 for the soundtrack. Come on Tim, Bomberman Hero has one of the console's, if not the console's best soundtrack, so that score is just criminal. As is the overall 66% score for this import review. This time I'm going to say N64 Magazine definitely got it very, very wrong here. Thankfully though, Martin Kitts gets us back on track with the NBA Courtside import review, and this gets a monster 90% score. I was a big basketball fan during this era, and so I knew that I needed this game day one if it got released in Europe. It sounded like the perfect blend between arcade and simulation, with a fine balance being struck. Not as over the top as something like NBA Jam, but far more playable than any of the other basketball games so far on the console. In fact, they loved the game so much they called it the second best sports game on the console behind International Superstar Soccer 64, which is some high praise indeed, although with games like FIFA 64 on the system, the competition wasn't all that fierce. Badger baiting and Russian roulette are described as pastimes that the magazine would rather be doing than playing a baseball game, and to be fair, Power Pro Baseball 5 was never going to review that well in the UK. From American sports, baseball is well behind in terms of popularity over here, and so we all knew that this was going to be a no chance in terms of ever getting a European release. I never saw it in store shelves, and also after a 78% score, I had no intention of importing this one back in the day. This month's how-to guides kick off with a game that I do actually love, however, and that's Forsaken. They give some general overall tips for the game, but there's some useful strafing tactics which can help you in certain situations, and some good ideas to how to lessen the volume of enemies that you're taking on each time. As the game also has multiple routes through the game, they do give you some tips on the best way to progress through the game, and also hints about which weapons are best used in different situations. The game is incredibly tough in places, and so the part of the guide which focuses on how to tackle each boss battle is also very welcome. In particular, they already had the perfect strat down for taking down the game's final boss, and so if you are struggling to complete this game, then do give this a read through because what they suggest actually works perfectly. A very cool competition was launched where you could win an N64 with 3 games or alternatively 6 games of your choice. To win, all you had to do was send them a piece of Americana, and that's it. The most creative person wins. Funnily enough, James also states that he thinks the USA will win the World Cup by 2010, and James, we're still waiting. The next how-to guide is how to grapple your way to victory in WCW vs NWO, and for the time this was actually a fairly solid guide to help anyone. Of course, these days most of us are quite au fait with the Aki Engine wrestling games, but let's not forget at the time that this was released it really was something special. They also tell you how to unlock the game's secret characters, but funnily, they felt that Joe Bruiser was a naff character, but I always loved using him and just knocking people out. A short guide with some tips for how to win the trophy in World Cup 98. For anyone taking part in the Skill Club 64 challenge, this guide will be of some help if you're not used to football games in general. But for everybody else, there's really not much here that is revolutionary, and you'd probably pick up the basics, which is what this guide is essentially covering. The final how-to guide, on the other hand, is for experts, and it covers how to discover every secret in Quake. Every single secret area in the game is explained on each level, and so for anyone who's replaying the game or anyone who's intent on finding everything the game has to offer, this will be a handy go-to guide to make sure that you don't miss out on anything. Just bear in mind that this is the second half of the guide, and so if you want levels 1 to 12, then you need to go back to the previous issue. Tips Extra has the usual roundup of cheat codes and GameShark codes, and this month I must give a shout out to the Shadows of the Empire cheat because to access it is one of the most convoluted cheat codes I've ever had the experience of entering. Readers' top tips also have some pretty cool and unique cheats, but perhaps the best was sent in by William Schutz from Norwich, who sent in a cheat for Nagano Winter Olympics. The cheat is that if you're suffering from insomnia, just go downstairs and play this game. It's quite funny that the magazine actually published this, and I'm sure that didn't go down well with Konami. The Nintendo Hotline has this month's most requested help, and it's for Mystical Ninja mostly, and being such a cool game I love seeing this, and people had some really good questions about upgrading their weapons and even missing items completely, so even now it's useful if you have a chance to read it and you are playing the game, because some of the items aren't required to complete the game, but it is fun to make sure that you've collected everything, and of course anyone that likes to fully engross themselves in the experience. A huge update to the Skill Club 64 leaderboard, and it's cool to see just how many people were taking part back in the day, with some epic gamers who already achieved gold status by completing all of the 10 challenges at that time. A brand new challenge was added this month, which was for Yoshi's Story, which was bound to get even Gold Club members back working towards new completions. Of course, don't forget that if you want to join in the Skill Club 64 challenge that we're currently doing, then just head over to our Discord for all the latest goings on. I'm the Best has a roundup of readers' submissions, and Star Performance Award this week went to a Greek chap who sent in proof of a perfect 9,999 score in Snowball Kids Trick Contest mode, and also Stuart Richards from Dorking, who in Fighter's Destiny had a 100% completion of the game, including taking down 105 opponents in the survival mode, which is an epic feat indeed. Now, this month's Club 64 letters from readers are a fairly bland mix. The usual ranting and raving about developers not making N64 games is always here, but let's go to some cool ideas in Dream On, which a reader suggested a James Bond RPG for the N64, and there's also another person complaining about the delay for the release of 1080 Snowboarding, and the magazine explaining that they were changing some of the branding in the game, and also the fact that Nintendo didn't want to release a snowboarding game in the middle of summer in Europe. There's also a letter from a kid named Mike Riley who goes ballistic about how bad he thinks Diddy Kong Racing is, and that he could smell it coming, and he says that the magazine is just biased because Rare are a British developer. The magazine rightly puts him in his place, but level 99 trolling in 1998 was still a thing, it seems. Subscribe to N64 Magazine and you get 2 free issues, or alternatively subscribe to me and you get free videos to watch each week. Shameless self-promotion. Games Directory, as always, has an ever-expanding summary of every game reviewed so far to act as a handy reference guide. This month's featured article is how to find your ideal video game career. It's actually a very well written article which not only pointed you in the right direction for educational establishments which were offering anything game related in terms of qualifications, but also it gave you a summary of different roles within the gaming industry and their expected salaries for the year 1998. What's most shocking, however, is just how little has changed in some of the entry-level salaries on offer in the gaming industry. Now we're 27 years later. Sure, some always were minimum wage positions, but when you contrast some of these to what a quick Google search will also tell you about these salaries today, then you can see that today some of these positions actually pay far less in real terms than what they did do back in the day. It's a very sad state of affairs indeed, and I know it just shows how the world has changed in this regard over the past, nearly 3 decades. And on that sombre note, we come to an end for this issue, and in the next issue we're taking a long-awaited final review look for Banjo Kazooie. But as always, if you're interested in reading any of these magazines, then head to the link in the description below for the digital PDF copies. As always though, thanks for watching, and until next time.